Texas is one of the industrial and economic powerhouses of the US. If it was allowed to secede from the country, it would certainly be able to thrive alone. However, that doesn't make it immune to population and societal issues, some of which are unique to the state while others plague the nation as a whole. Let's dig into why the Lone Star State might not be as perfect as you think. First off, it's undeniable that Texas is one of the fastest growing states in the country. The census data from 2010 onwards suggests that the population is growing at a rate of roughly 1.5% per year. In total, the population of Texas increased by more than 19% between 2010 and 2022, compared to the national average of only 7.7% across all states. In fact, between July 2022 and July of 2023, Texas accounted for 30% of the nation's total population growth. Out of the 1.6 million people the US gained as a whole, just over 470,000 of them became Texas residents. The state celebrated crossing the 30 million population threshold in 2022. Of course, California remains the most populous state with roughly 39 million citizens at the time, but Texas's population is increasing at the cost of California's. So let's start with how Texas managed to grow. There are three main avenues for how the population can grow in the US. The first one is natural, the result of the difference between births and deaths in the state itself. On that front, Texas is doing relatively well. Even though there were fewer recorded births in the state during 2022 than the previous year, there were even fewer recorded deaths in the state as well, giving Texas an overall positive replacement rate. But natural population growth only accounts for between 25 and 30% of the new population each year. The other two avenues are much more vital and are due to immigration, international and intranational. The first is relatively obvious, counting new citizens that come from other countries. International migration in Texas accounts for roughly 40% of all migration, roughly 20% of the total population growth. Perhaps the most important reason behind Texas's explosive population growth is migration within the US, which is also why California is losing citizens. The single largest flow of people moving between states in 2022 happened between California to Texas, with almost 100,000 movers going from the former to the latter. Some of the most common reasons why US citizens want to move to Texas include the relative affordability of houses and utilities, lack of taxes, and a different political sphere. Compared to California, for example, Texas has roughly 20% lower utility costs, owing to the fact that Texas is a significant electricity, oil, and gas producer across the US, and the median house value in 2021 was nearly half that of California's. Of course, there's a matter of politics, considering California has been a blue state for a while Texas has remained largely red, despite much of the western United States turning blue for years. The last part is largely due to the fact that Texas is massive. It's by far the biggest state in the contiguous US, with significant swaths of both urban and rural areas, which is a nightmare we'll talk about later, and not nearly as lopsided an urban to rural population ratio as California. While Texas is still considered a majority-minority state, with overwhelming Republican support across the board. 180 out of the 254 counties in Texas have moved closer to the Republican side. While that's still in favor of the majority, it tells us that a significant number of counties are still leaning left. So why is this important? Well, while we mentioned the overwhelming population growth in Texas, it also bears elaborating that this growth skews away from small regions. Counties that belong to the state's major population centers of Houston, Dallas-Fort Worth, Austin, and San Antonio typically see the highest growth rates. On the other hand, over 90 counties, mostly in the South and the West, have actually lost population over the last few years. This can create a situation where some areas will see a significant shift in the discrepancy between local and national politics and how it shapes representation. Additionally, the rapidly rising urban population has led to the cost of living skyrocketing in the cities. According to the Texas Comptroller of Public Accounts, the average house price in Texas rose by over 40% between 2019 and 2023. But the cities have it much worse, with the Houston area seeing price increases of 128% over that same period. That means that the price of an average home in Houston has more than doubled within just 4 years. By contrast, incomes that qualified for a mortgage of an average home rose by only 45% in the area. The main causes? The aforementioned population increases, housing shortages, and different work policies. The COVID-19 pandemic caused a significant shift towards work-from-home policies. In 2020 and 2021, it was one of the main reasons why so many Californians moved to Texas, with cheaper house prices being the major contributor. Overall, roughly 16% of Texans worked from home as of 2021, compared to only 6% before the pandemic started. This has allowed many more suburban areas to thrive, typically at the expense of the already congested cities. With the rise of online work, you'd think that more Texans would be in favor of leaving the congested cities and moving to more rural areas. However, that doesn't seem to be the case. The current major population centers in Texas are all supported by an extensive infrastructure network and have extremely developed industries, both in the tech and energy sectors, perhaps two of the most significant drivers behind Texas becoming an economic powerhouse of the US. As a result, the rest of the state is relatively disconnected from the center. One of the examples where infrastructure matters is that Texas is one of the states that sees significant impact from hurricanes. Hurricane Beryl caused 36 deaths and significant property damage. But even regular storms can leave Texas wanting for basic utilities. Case in point, Texas experienced 210 instances of major electrical outages, affecting more than 50,000 people between 2020 and 2023. By contrast, the next highest on that dubious list is California with 145, and that state has its own share of problems. In addition, Beryl hit Houston, one of the state's largest cities, which is already well positioned to handle infrastructure issues. The more rural areas don't really stand a chance. But not all infrastructure is made equal. The Texan government allocates the state's budget differently depending on whether communities or counties are predominantly urban or rural. In the 2020 census, the US government slightly changed the requirements for whether a municipality is considered urban or rural, resulting in some 4.2 million people across the country becoming rural citizens without moving. According to these new guidelines, Texas remains the state with the largest number of citizens living in rural areas, at roughly 7 million. Ultimately, this creates a tricky situation for the state government. A state like California, with more than 90% urban population, can easily allocate significant resources for urban planning, particularly infrastructure and city services. On the other hand, Texas has a rural population closer to Maryland, which is 27 times smaller in land area while containing about a fifth of Texas's population. Just let those two numbers sink in a bit. The Texan government needs to connect counties that are much farther apart to service all of its citizens, and the cities still represent a significant population portion of the state to make that possible. Still, ignoring the problems of rural communities leaves 7 million citizens left out in the cold. To put this into perspective, a state with 7 million people, Massachusetts, is the 15th most populous state in the US. But despite these issues, one of Texas's biggest problems is housing and how it's regulated. According to 2019 estimates, Texas was 330,000 housing units short of what would be ideal for the state's population numbers, with only California going through a bigger housing crisis. The 2024 estimate isn't much better, at 306,000 units short. The government has two issues that it needs to tackle to remedy this. The first problem is the rising housing costs. As mentioned, some cities have experienced unparalleled housing cost increases over the last few years, and the trend doesn't seem to be slowing down. But perhaps the bigger issue is one related to Texas zoning laws and minimal plot sizes for homes. In a city, this directly contributes to rising housing costs, since investors will ultimately make a house on a larger plot to retain that traditional setting of a home with a large yard, which means a higher cost. Apart from increasing the cost of the house, plot sizes have also been linked to racial segregation by the way of making them unattainable for low-income families of color. Plot sizes also directly impact city infrastructure. Larger homes mean that a municipality can have only so many of them in an area, which limits population density for higher-cost housing. Additionally, the city architecture itself begins sprawling outwards, creating larger, less walkable cities that only increase the need for cars or complicated public transport and lead to a rise in carbon emissions. Some cities have started working on the issue. Houston, for example, has a minimal lot size of only 1,400 square feet. This can permit tens of thousands of new housing units to be built inside the city or the creation of more urban areas that directly connect to it. The state as a whole has arguably not made much headway in this regard. While the Houston change is a boon, it happened way back in 2013. Other parts of the state have yet to follow through, usually due to the aforementioned issue of lack of bipartisan support across counties. However, a bigger issue is perhaps that the state government simply hasn't spent enough on public housing. Texas has come 49th in the US in housing expenditure as a share of its overall budget, ranking only slightly above Nebraska, a state with only 2 million people. This neatly outlines the biggest issue with Texas's people problem. Unlike many other states, the people of Texas live too far apart and in conditions too varied. The red-blue political divide across counties makes implementing statewide laws difficult, and the previous notion of Texas being affordable has all but disappeared. Even if the government creates a solution, the sheer size and scale of the problem will take years to get implemented. By that time, Texas might no longer be the second most populous state, but instead the first, and it will bear significantly more pressure. But what do you think? Leave your thoughts and ideas in the comments section below, and as always, thank you for watching.